Hi, everybody. That was a very interesting session. So, first of all, a bit of housekeeping. If you're here expecting to see Patrick Meyer, he could not do it. So he asked me to come here and do this presentation on his behalf and also moderate the two following panels. So he apologized profusely, but unfortunately he could not come. So what I'm going to do in this session is basically introduce a little bit the field of crisis mapping, what that is, and what has been happening so far in the field of crisis mapping, and then look a little bit about how we have been trying to deal inside crisis mapping, and specifically mapping of humanitarian emergencies, with the issue of verification of crowdsourced information. So crisis mapping, a bit of history. The terminology was created in 2006 by Patrick Meyer and Jennifer Linning at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. The idea was that they started realizing that there were a lot of tools available out there, and specifically a lot of tools related to web-based platforms and mapping platforms. And so in 2008, they basically created, 2007, sorry, they created a program on crisis mapping and early warning. And the idea was basically to explore the use of those technologies to help humanitarian responders on the ground on how to better use those type of tools. 2 years later, Patrick Meyer and Jen Zimke created the Crisis Mappers Network, the International Network of Crisis Mapping, and they convened the first conference on crisis mapping. Again, the idea was to create a network that was bringing together not only technologists and people working with technology and using technology and creating technology for humanitarian response, but to bring together with them people actually working in humanitarian response. And so the idea was to start a conversation in between the two to start understanding what could be done in a different way now that new technologies were available out there. So what is crisis mapping? We basically define it at 4 different components: collection of information, analysis, visualization, and decision-making processes. Now, collection of information is kind of very simple, right? We have been doing it for years. You basically collect different type of information. You can do surveys, you can do focus groups. This has been happening both in journalism, if you want, or in humanitarian emergencies in different ways. The difference is that right now we have different tools that we can use to collect information. And while before a lot of the information was collected in person, on face-to-face interaction, now a lot of this information can be collected in different ways, like, for example, through the use of mobile technology or satellite imageries. The second component is the visualization, and that's the one that kind of like became the most visible one, if you want, in terms of how crisis mapping have been spreading around the world, which is basically the idea that with new technologies, we also now have different ways in which we can visualize the information that we collect. It's not just about a spreadsheet with a lot of data in it. It's not just about a simple graph. Now we have 3D GIS mapping. We have something like the USAID platform that allows you to map in real-time information in the precise moment in which they arrive to you. And we have different types of visualization tools that are being developed. Like, for example, if you're curious about it, I invite you to go and look, for example, at a tool called like Geophidia. And then we have the analysis. Now, the analysis is something that a lot of people normally do not talk about, but it's actually one of the main important things when you're collecting information. You can, for example, go on Twitter and Facebook and follow an hashtag and have a lot of information coming out. You get a lot of data out of it. But then what is this data telling you? That's something that is very difficult to understand. The analysis is the idea that out of noise, you need to be able to hear the right or the relevant voices. And in crisis mapping, you do it through the analysis of the data that you are collecting. And tools for analysis are multiple and different and have been used even before, for example, in GIS type of analysis. And then you have the fourth component, which is decision-making. Now, if you are collecting a lot of information, you're analyzing it, you're visualizing it, your ultimate goal is that someone that needs to make a decision now can make a better informed decision because they have a better pool of information available for them. And now this is basically really the ultimate goal on how are you using this information. You can map as many tweets as you want, but if at the end of the day nobody is changing the way they're acting because of the information that you are displaying, or you're not really affecting decision-making processes, especially when we're talking about humanitarian emergencies, then there is no point in collecting all this information from affected communities, for example. This is kind of like, if you want, the first turning point of crisis mapping. It was the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. What happened was that a group of students from Fletcher School and supported by Ushahidi created an interactive map collecting information coming directly from the affected population. And the very interesting part of this project was that the information was coming from mobile phones in a kind of way, a sort of anonymous source, if you want. The information was processed by tons of students in Fletcher and around the world, people that did not know each other, that was basically accessing a website and processing information coming from Haiti. And the map was actually used by the US Coastal Guard and some humanitarian organizations on the ground to understand what was happening in Haiti. And this is kind of like a very interesting video that I invite all of you to watch. This is OpenStreetmap, and I'm sure that Harry will talk more about it. OpenStreetmap, I think in few days, 700 volunteers all over the world started mapping online Port-au-Prince and Haiti during the emergency. And they did something like 1.4 million edits to the map and created one of the most up-to-date map of Port-au-Prince and Haiti, just a few days after the earthquake. Now, this is a very interesting example of the use of crisis mapping by a media outlet. This is a Washington Post. There was I think it was something after the Haiti earthquake. There was a huge snowstorm in Washington. And Washington Post decided to set up a crisis map. Now, the interesting part about this crisis map was not just that Washington Post wanted to map information on social media or Facebook or Twitter about the snowstorm, but what they did is that they started mapping not just what was happening, but the solutions that people had available with them that they could offer to others. So basically, this map was a very interesting project because it became not just a visualization of data, but it became a way for people to offer their help to other people, in a kind of way bypassing the emergency responders that at the time in Washington were actually also stalked by the snow. And so through the use of the map, a lot of people start helping each other because they realize that, the first responders are actually the people that are on the ground. And after a while, there was the creation of the Standby Task Force. This was during the Crisis Mappers Conference of 2010. And basically, me, Patrick Mayer, Helena, and a bunch of other people that had been involved before with using volunteers and doing crisis mapping realized that there was a lot that was happening, and that instead of every time that there was an emergency just running to try to support humanitarian responders on the ground and trying to coordinate volunteers all over the world, we could create a system for people that wanted to volunteer in emergency to just start getting some basic trainings on how to use social media, how to look at how can you gather information from Twitter and Facebook and verify it and make it available for humanitarian responders on the ground. And this was one of our first projects, the Libya Crisis Map. And what is interesting about it, I'm not going to go very much in depth about what the Standby Task Force does, because I think Helena will do it. But what is interesting about this project was that UN OCHA contacted a group of 800 volunteers and told them, there's a crisis in Libya, we don't have access, we don't know what is going on, we need someone to help us figure it out. And the only way we can figure this out is by looking at what's available online. Social media, blogs, local news coming through different ways through the internet. And so the volunteers started collecting this information and mapping them on a Ushahidi platform. And that was the first time where we actually had to sit down and start thinking about how can we verify this information? We don't have anyone that we know in Libya. We have tons of information available online. People retweet, edit retweets, repost stuff taken from other sources and change them a little bit. How can we be able to provide this information to a humanitarian organization like UN OCHA and make this information at least a little bit reliable? This is another project, and it's a project that I've been working on with Freedom House in Egypt during the parliamentary elections. There was still the Mubarak regime. Electoral monitoring was illegal in the country, but Egyptians were using a lot blogs, Facebook, and Twitter to communicate and to look at violations of human rights and violation of electoral rights. And so a group of bloggers asked Freedom House to support them in the creation of a crisis map to monitor the elections. And what was interesting about this was that they were using all sorts of possible means. They had Twitter, they had a Facebook page, they were using emails, they had an SMS phone number where people could text in. The interesting part of this project was that the structure of it was very much a decentralized system. So we started thinking about, okay, if we collect all this information, how can we verify it? We don't have electoral monitors on the ground, but we have people on the ground, right? People go to vote. They're going to be there when something happens. And so we created a decentralized system where each region had its own team working on verification. And the way the verification was dealt with was basically through different steps. First of all, it was requested for people sending in information to add either a video or a picture or a multimedia component to their information so that we could look at what was the information really about. But apart from that, we had a very complex system of communicating back with the people on the ground, calling people that were sending in information and asking them several questions to describe the information in a much better way. What is interesting about that is that it's true that people can always lie. It's also true that it's not that difficult to understand when someone is lying. What was also very interesting about this is that it was entirely managed by Blogger. So if you want, it was very much a citizen journalism project. But the entire verification team was managed by former journalists from Thomson Reuters. And one of the things that we discussed with them was exactly something that was already mentioned in the panel before me, which was that the skills and the ability that journalists have and the methodologies that they have developed through years on how to verify information must be the base of whatever other methodology or tool that we develop to verify crowdsourced information or information collected through social media. This is another very interesting project that is actually still going on. We mentioned before the crisis in Syria. Here we go a little bit more into what it's kind of like a new field of crisis mapping, which is the introduction and the use of a lot of algorithms, if you want, and mechanical Turks and machine learning processes. So the idea is that a group of activists from Syria wanted to monitor what was going on. And so they wanted basically to do media monitoring, collecting all the information available on media to understand exactly how many people were dying in the crisis, how many people were injured, what exactly was going on. And so what they did is that they don't just set up a platform, they basically start working with Harvard, and they started working with this project at Harvard, which is called Health Map. What Health Map does is that is a project that has been going on for several years now. What they do is that they map news, media news related to disease. The way they do it is that, though, they don't have volunteers working on it, filtering every single piece of information and mapping it. What they do is that they develop an algorithm. Actually, they develop 3 different algorithms that works one on the top of the other, that basically look for specific words and combination of words in sentences and articles, and then trying to extract from that information the location and the specific disease that that piece of news or media is talking about, and automatically mapping it online on Health Map. And so basically what the Syria Tracker is now doing is to use exactly the same system and try to develop their own gazetteer of combination of words and try to use the same system to map information about Syria. The very good and encouraging results so far is that they managed to map at least 2,000 incidents, and all of them have been verified. This is another project done in collaboration with the Standby Task Force. There was the earthquake in Turkey. What is fascinating about this is a different approach to verification. So I don't know, many of you can read Turkish, but the green box on the top of this map is basically saying, this is an Al Jazeera project, is basically saying that Al Jazeera is not responsible for the verification of this information. The only thing that they're doing is collecting and display this information for the public to look at. And that if someone wants to verify this information, it's entirely up to them to decide how to consider or how to evaluate this information. And to me, coming from a media background, this is extremely interesting, because basically what Al Jazeera is doing, it's saying, you know, we're putting the burden of the verification on the users of the information. The burden of verification is not anymore on us. We don't take that responsibility because we don't have the capacity in this situation to take that responsibility. It's entirely up to you, looking at this map, to decide What do you think it's credible? What you think it's not credible? And I think that this also raised a lot of questions about, is this where we're going? Is this like the future of how media will do verification or will not do verification of crowdsourced information? So basically, we go back to what was mentioned before, right? Trust but verify. And so now I'm going to talk about two different projects that I've been doing with Internews. And the interesting part I think about these two projects is the role that journalists come to play into an environment of humanitarian emergencies in which people want to do crowdsourcing. So this project was done in Central African Republic, and basically the idea was that Internews is working with 15 radio stations throughout the whole country. It's very hard for humanitarian organizations to access those areas because of security reasons. But each of these area has a community radio station and has journalists working in the community radio station that every day collect information and spread the news in their community about what is going on. Now, one of the things that we realize is that because of the majority of community radio stations are completely underfunded, most of the journalists there are actually volunteers. There was a lot of information more, specifically a lot of data more available in the local population, in the refugee camps, in the IDP camps in those areas that was not gathered by the journalists because of resources. They didn't have the money or the ability to move and go to those areas and collect this information. And so they started doing crowdsourcing through different ways. They started setting up messages boxes at the water pumps where people could put in pieces of paper writing, what was going on in their community. They had blackboards in the markets. They used mobile technology where there was mobile phones. They could use SMS or having people calling into the radio station. And they basically set up a crowdsourcing system. Now, can you imagine when we went to the humanitarian community in Bangui and we said we're crowdsourcing information about the humanitarian emergency in the country, the response was, well, you're crazy. I'm never going to use an information coming from people that I don't know. Or even more, I'm never going to design my response to the humanitarian emergency based on information that I don't know where they're coming from. And so we thought about it and we said, okay, but you trust journalists in a kind of way because you know that journalists know how to verify information. They've been always doing it. It's their credibility at stake. They will still do it. They will never broadcast any information that they haven't verified. Oh, that's what we hope. And so we said, okay, why don't we put the journalist in the middle of this system? Why don't we have the radio station doing the crowdsourcing, the radio station verifying this information, and then the verified information is channeled through the radio station to the humanitarian community? So what we came out with is, again, a map where all sorts of information coming from the communities is mapped and it's visualized and categorized according to different humanitarian categories. You have alerts and then response and needs. And basically, all the pieces of information here are coming from anonymous sources. We don't know who are the people that send this information in. But we do know that all the journalists that are sending this information to the map have been verified this information. A second project that uses a system that is fairly similar is the one that I've been working on recently for the election in Ukraine, which will happen next month. Election has been always kind of like in the crisis mapping field also a very hot topic in terms of how do you verify information, what's the difference between professional verification of information in elections and just citizen monitoring if you want. And so this project is being done by Internews Ukraine. And the idea of this project is to put together electoral monitors, professional electoral monitors that have been trained to do electoral monitoring, and a group of 40 journalists that have not been trained on how to do electoral monitoring, but they know very well how to do verification of information on the ground, and then the crowd. So the idea is that everybody in Ukraine is allowed to report on anything related to elections and to the electoral process. And the journalists on the ground and the electoral monitors will go and verify this information. Now, of course, they can't just verify everything, right? And so we have been talking for a very long time, and this is just a draft of a matrix that came out of that project on what are exactly the steps that you have to do to look at how can you verify every single piece of information coming into this platform. And you can see here, there's like, reports coming from social media, reports coming, from mobile, reports coming from email, and then all sorts of other type of submissions. The idea is there are different type of steps that we can go through to try to verify as much as possible information coming from social media or anonymous sources. So there are ways to do it. They may be very complex, they may be very time-consuming, but they are there. And the majority of the structure that it's here, it's based on the way that journalists normally use to verify information. One of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that when we're talking about verification of information, we're not talking necessarily and only about verifying a piece of text. We're talking about how do you verify a video? How do you understand from a picture what can be true or not? And I think that the BBC User-Generated Content Hub have been doing a lot of work on that. And it's fascinating and very interesting to look at how this can be done in actually a fairly accurate way. So the point of my presentation is basically that there are different ways that you can, if you want, falsify information. There are different ways that you can verify information. What is extremely important is if either you're working with crowdsourced information or bounded crowdsourced information, still at the end of the day, you're talking about processes that have been in place already. And the role of media in this process, it's not over. And it's not over because the verification of information and the verification of sources has been there before and has been done before. What is new is the machine learning processes and the fact that right now you can add a lot of technology to it, and this can help. And I'm not saying that we're going to substitute people with machines or with algorithms, but they are there. And they can be used. And if you're not going to use it, someone else is going to use it. It's the same thing with social media. If you, as a journalist, if you don't want to use Twitter, don't use it. But other people will be using it. And they will be the first one to put the news out. And so the point for me is kind of like trying to think about, how do we integrate these two things? Crisis mapping is trying to learn as much as possible from the world of media in understanding how you can make crowdsourced information meaningful and available, but also how you can make crowdsourced information useful for people making decisions on the ground. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Would you like to comment on Putin, what he did during the Russian elections by putting webcams across the country on all the election booths, creating a huge amount of data nobody really knew what to do with. It was kind of a weird, absurdist, a waste of money, according to many, but nonetheless, isn't this what you provoke, if I understand well? Is this really where you want to take it?
Well, the thing is that's definitely not where I want to take it. Is where it's going to go, no matter what. So if you ask me, if I can decide what everybody else is going to do, I will always and only have people using it in a good way. The thing is that when you have tools out there available for everybody, everybody is going to use it to their own advantage. So I think that the issue here is not where we want to go. Is if we know where we want to go, then we should work towards that. There's always going to be someone that is going to use those tools in a bad way, if you want. But if you know how they're going to use it in a bad way, you know what you can do. And you have to keep this in mind. There's no way to stop it, right? There's no way to stop someone from sending out false tweets. But you can start analyzing who they are, analyzing their bio, triangulate the information they're sending out, and get closer to the ability of understanding if this is true or not.
Any other questions?
Oh, yes, please.
We've done a bit of, we've had a go at mapping at the BBC, and one of the big issues for us wasn't so much about verification authenticity, it was about relevance and responsiveness. We did stuff around the tube strike, for example, in London. We did various snow maps, but one of the issues that we didn't really kind of get a decent answer to was how we can make that map relevant, because the information would come in, and by the time it came up, it was, out of date, and then it was posted, so the map then lost its value and its use. And I just wonder how you deal with those kind of issues with on a much bigger scale.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing. On a much bigger scale, the thing is that, and that's the reason why, for example, the Standby Task Force exists, you have 900 volunteers working at the same time. So that's kind of like, in a kind of way, if you want, you don't solve the issue, but you address the issue putting much broader resources into that, right? You crowdsource the mapping, basically. So instead of being, you know, a team of people paid to do that, that do it in a certain way, if you want, you have 900 volunteers online that have been trained to do that in real time. So the time span in between when the information comes in and when the information is mapped is much shorter. And that's basically almost the way it has been done. The way Health Map is doing it is through algorithms, right? But they have spent years in, like, they have 3 algorithms run one on the top of the other. They have developed a gazetteer. They do cross-matching of different type of words, and now the position of a certain words in a sentence can mean something or something else. So I think that it, to me, is a kind of a combination of the two. One is definitely adding new pieces of technology. The other one is adding new methodologies. So instead of having a team of people sitting down and doing the mapping of the information, is crowdsource the mapping of the information out again. But definitely, I also have to add, I'm a strong supporter of crisis mapping and mapping in general, but I also truly believe that a lot of maps that are available out there are absolutely useless, because you map something when the geographical location has a relevance. And it is adding a piece of information. Mapping for the sake of displaying an awesome fancy maps with a lot of dots in it, that is super interactive and you can look at a lot of different type of information together, may be super fancy and very good looking, may absolutely give you no information in addition to the one that a spreadsheet will give to you.
Yeah, that's exactly
yeah. No, I agree.
Hi. I am a geographer by profession. With all the crowdsourced mapping, we call them neographers. Now, and I hear a lot of talk about the quality of the data and the data checking and everything, and it's all done by journalists. And for some reason, I always thought that data checking should be done by data analysts and not by journalists, because they're not, well, it's not really nice to say perhaps in this audience, but
it's fine.
They're not as reliable as most data analysts. They're not as objective, whatever. But journalists are used, and how many geographers do you use? For example, what you just said here about mapping, that a beautiful map, as long as it doesn't bring out the information, the message, getting the message across, yeah, then it's a useless map. And there are so many useless maps indeed. So how many geographers or cartographers do you use in your organization to really add value to that?
Well, in my organization, depends which one you're talking about, because I work for a lot of different organizations. But in general, I would say it really depends, right? So if you are mapping dots on a UshID platform, you really do not need an analyst to do that. It's a dot on a map that tells you here something is happening. There's not a lot of, you can add the analysis at the end of it, right? Once you have gathered a lot of information, then you can say, okay, this dot represents incidents. This incident can be break down into different components. How can I analyze the components of the different incidents to come out with an analysis of how the phenomenon, for example, have been developing over time in that specific incident? To do that, you absolutely need geographers and you need data analysts. And if we want to, when we want to do that, we hire them and we have them doing it for us. Internews, for example, in Kenya, we're doing now training for journalists on digital journalism, if you want, or data journalism. And we started at the beginning by saying, oh, great, we have an open data project, and all the journalists are going to use it. There's tons of data in it. And then we realized that the majority of the journalists did not know how to use a spreadsheet. And so we went back to, okay, let's do a training on how you use an Excel spreadsheet. This is how you use it. This is how you make a graph out of it. So definitely there are certain specific professional skills that belong to specific field. And I think that we're going to touch briefly on this in the second panel that we're going to have today, because that's something that I definitely want to talk about, is like the interaction in between volunteerism, if you want. And you will have two great examples of that. And I think you will find very interesting the example from OpenStreetmap and the interaction in between this kind of world and the kind of like professionals, if you want, which is the same one that you find in journalism. I have journalists that come to me and say, don't use the word citizen journalism. There's not such a thing as citizen journalism. There's professional journalism and there's people blogging. How do you answer to that, right? Like, how do you, look at what is the interaction in between these two worlds? But we'll definitely touch more on that in the two panels.